So, how do you buy a good steak? A very short version is prime, dry-aged, ribeye or New York strip that is 1.5 inches thick. That's it. End of the video. Bye-bye. Just kidding, you know me better than that. Prime, choice, grass-fed, Angus, dry-aged, so many words. What do they all mean? And which ones are worth paying for? Which cut is the most tender? Which cut is the most beefy? And what's the ideal thickness for a steak? Okay, let's talk. First, let's talk about the cuts. The most tender steaks come from the back of the animal, because the back doesn't do much work. Here they are in order of tenderness, assuming they come from the same animal. Tenderloin, huge on tenderness, low on flavor. Ribeye, not quite tenderloin, but still very tender and huge on flavor. New York strip, almost as tender and flavorful as a ribeye. A porterhouse or T-bone is really two steaks in one. New York strip on one side and tenderloin on the other. Sirloin is not New York strip, even though people often use the words loin and sirloin interchangeably. New York strip is the loin, also known as short loin, and sirloin is the area of the cow behind the short loin section. Sirloin is way leaner and way less flavorful than the loin or the New York strip, and thus cheaper. My two favorite, less fancy steaks are skirt steak and hanger steak. Both are from the plate, the front of the belly. I am not a fan of flat iron steak, it's a cut from the shoulder, or the flank steak, it's a cut from the bottom abdomen that is also known as London broil. Flat iron and flank are very tough. I often get a question in my meat classes of how do you cook London broil? The best solution to that is don't cook London broil. See, problem solved. If I had to give you a list of steaks in order of flavor, ribeye and skirt steak would be the beefiest, and the tenderloin and sirloin would be the most mild, with the New York strip and hanger in between. Our next topic is the grades of beef. This is US specific, by the way, because different countries grade their meat differently. Prime is the highest grade, and it's only given to 4% of American beef. Choice is the next level down. It's given to 40% of American beef, and below that is select. Pretty much everything you see in supermarkets is choice. Prime beef is not easy to find. The supermarkets that carry it consistently in my area are Wegmans and Costco. BJ's has it too, I hear, but I don't have a membership there. Whole Foods has Prime also, but not all stores and not all the time. Prime beef is much more expensive than choice. Is it worth it? Yes, it is. It's probably the only label that guarantees a certain level of flavor and tenderness. There are two things USDA inspectors look for in beef to give it a prime label. They want a soft texture and a very high level of marbling. This gives you the flavor. Marbling is not just any fat. The fat cap around the muscle doesn't get you any brownie points with the inspectors. Marbling are the little specks of fat inside the muscle. The higher, the better. USDA certified Angus. You see this label on many meat packages, but does it mean anything? No, not really. Angus is a breed of cows. To be USDA certified Angus, the meat has to have relatively good texture, and it has to come from cows that are most likely Angus cows. These cows aren't genetically tested, they just look at their coats. If the coats are red and black, they consider them to be Angus enough. I've had some beef labeled Angus that was really excellent and very tender, and some not so much. For example, Wegmans sells skirt steak and hanger steak that are labeled Angus, and they are simply incredible. Great flavor and the most tender examples of those cuts. But I've also had Angus beef that wasn't anything to write home about. Meat can become a lot more tender and flavorful if a cow is broken down into its primal cuts and hung in humidity-controlled walk-in refrigerators for 3 to 4 weeks. The beef can be aged even longer, at which point it will become somewhat funky. I've only had 3-month-old beef once and it was not my cup of tea. But 3 to 4 week aged beef is fantastic. If you've ever seen a case of dry aged beef and thought to yourself, who wants to eat this dried up stuff? Don't worry. All the dried up outside is trimmed before the cut is portioned into steaks and sold. Since dry aging is a somewhat expensive procedure, it's usually reserved for somewhat expensive steaks like ribeye and New York strip. When I buy these 2 cuts, I always try to get either prime or dry aged steaks, or if I don't mind paying an awful lot, then both prime and dry aged, like these 2 beauties are here. Everyone in my family was really excited about this video. We had more amazing beef in 2 days than we usually have in the entire month. Most cows are started on grass and finished on grain. There are some cows that are 100% grass-fed, but not many. The question is how much time they spend on grass versus grain. Cows that are primarily grass-fed are a lot leaner than grain-fed cows. Can a grass-fed steak be tender and beefy? For some breeds of cows, given enough dry aging after the cow is butchered, they can produce a fantastic steak even without a grain finish. I had some wonderful grass-fed beef in California and in Spain, but I've never had it in Massachusetts. Where I live, people who buy grass-fed beef are primarily doing so because it's good for the environment or good for their health. Taste is not their first concern. In Massachusetts, I've never found properly aged grass-fed beef. All the grass-fed beef that I've tried was tough. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to buy a steak at a farmer's market. There were pictures of happy cows, there were pictures of happy farmers. All the steaks came out of a freezer, which probably didn't do much to improve their texture, and they sucked. Your experience with grass-fed beef might be totally different. You might have access to way better grass-fed beef than I do. In case you're curious if there is such a thing as grass-fed prime beef, no. Grass-fed beef never reaches the level of marbling required for the prime grade. What's important to take away from all of this is that there is no one factor that predicts how tender and flavorful your steak will be. You can have a tough ribeye and a tender hanger steak. The feed, the aging, the grade, and the cut all contribute to how the steak will taste. Blade tenderizing, that lovely practice most consumers aren't aware of. I used to buy my prime steaks at Costco. Unlike other supermarkets, they always had them, and the price was slightly better than Whole Foods or upscale butcher shops. But several years ago, I've noticed that they started blade tenderizing their prime beef. Blade tenderizing means feeding a piece of meat through a machine that pokes it with narrow knives in an effort to make it more tender. The idea of doing it on a prime ribeye is baffling. It's already tender. There are many downsides to this practice. The most obvious one is that this meat is no longer considered to be a solid muscle. So if you're serving it to someone with a compromised immune system, you're putting them at risk. To cover their ass legally, Costco puts cooked to 160 Fahrenheit on the package. But what idiot buys a prime steak and cooks it to 160 Fahrenheit? When you're working with a solid muscle, all the bacteria is only on the outside. When you sear the outside, the bacteria will die even if the steak is cold inside. But if the meat is poked with those stupid knives, the bacteria is driven from the outside into the center of the meat. The risk here is very small. I mean, the same as eating a medium rare burger. But it's higher than a solid muscle. So I prefer not to buy blade tenderized meat. Thickness doesn't seem like a big deal, but it can make or break your steak and is worth considering very carefully when you're buying. I know we talked a lot about aging, grades, etc., but most of the tenderness of your meat is determined by the temperature to which you cook it. That's the thing we call doneness, like medium rare. I like thick steaks or thin steaks, but not in between. Let me explain. If you are dealing with a very thin steak, in other words 2/3 of an inch or less, you cook it on a blazing hot grill or skillet just until it browns on each side and you're done. There's no testing for doneness for thin steaks. If you're cooking a steak that is thicker than 1 inch, you can use a thermometer to see how done it is. But if your steak is in that gray zone of 2/3 of an inch to 1 inch, you might be setting yourself up for a very risky situation. Some steaks, like the high-fat ribeye, shrink a lot when they cook. This ribeye and this New York strip were about the same thickness before cooking, but see how much thinner the ribeye is after cooking? A ribeye that starts at 1 inch can easily end up being only 1/2 inch thick after cooking, making it very difficult to insert a thermometer into it sideways and take an accurate reading of its inside temperature. This is particularly an issue when grilling. If you're doing a reverse sear or a sous vide preparation, you do your temperature check before the sear, and even a 1 inch thick steak will usually be thick enough for a thermometer. But for the grill, I really prefer my steaks to be 1.5 inches thick. If your steak is too thick for a quick sear, but too thin for a thermometer, it's all up to your intuition not to ruin it. You can certainly try to poke it with your finger, but let's face it, all that poking is just a way to make ourselves feel a little better that we are collecting some sort of data, even after many years of cooking. I still make mistakes when judging the doneness of medium thickness steaks. And why take that risk? Good steaks are so expensive that I want the right doneness on them every single time. Many times when I buy a ribeye, porterhouse, or a New York strip, I ask the meat guys at Whole Foods or Wegmans to cut me the exact thickness that I want. I find that many steaks at Wegmans are cut too thin, and many steaks at Whole Foods are cut too thick. Once you cross that 2 inch line, they really feel a bit more like roasts. Nothing wrong with that, but I want a certain ratio of brown outside to the red and juicy inside. So if I'm paying $30 a pound for my meat, I want what I want. I know I've made a lot of videos on cooking steak with sous vide and with reverse sear methods, but in the summer, nothing beats a perfectly grilled steak. Several years ago, I covered this topic in great detail. The link to my steak grilling video is right here. The only way to learn to buy a great steak is to buy different steaks and see what tastes best to you. But to do that successfully, you have to compare apples to apples. If you cooked one steak to medium rare and another steak to medium well, you really can't compare their textures. So yeah, get the thermometer, watch the video, and practice. Since my steak grilling video focuses on thick steaks, I thought I should give you a few tips on how to deal with a skirt steak. I mean, skirt steak is always thin. I am personally a thick steak person all the way, but even I think that grilled skirt steak is pretty awesome. I'll be honest with you, when I unwrapped this particular skirt steak, I was disappointed. Skirt steak is always thin. It ranges from 3/4 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch thick. Since I got this one at Wegmans and paid a scary $22 a pound for it, I thought they'd give me the thick part. Usually they do. But turns out they folded it many times, and once unwrapped, this steak was ridiculously thin. I really thought there was no way to not overcook it, but it actually turned out just fine. Here's what I did. I got my grill insanely hot. As always, I used foil on the area that I plan to use to bump up the temperature and preheat it for 15 minutes. What this skirt steak had going for it is a thin layer of fat all around. This really helped with speeding up browning. Of course, too much fat could lead to flare-ups, so I trimmed it just a little. To help it brown even faster, I coated it in a thin layer of my standard grilling glaze. Here's a video on how to make it. The way this glaze works is that it contains a small amount of soy sauce and pomegranate molasses. The sugars in these ingredients encouraged my steak to brown faster. I proceeded just like I would with a thick steak, oiled the grate and placed the steak on top. I flipped it after only 90 seconds, gave it another 60 seconds on the second side and pulled it off. The outside was brown and the inside actually came out medium rare and juicy in all but the thinnest part of the steak. Oh yeah, about that price. $22 a pound for a skirt steak? Crazy, right? I can buy skirt steak at Whole Foods for about $17, but there is no comparison in terms of texture. Wagman's skirt has the texture more typical of a ribeye. It's that tender. Is there any way to predict the tenderness before buying the steak from a specific store for the first time? Not really. Unfortunately, you just have to try it, and if you like what you're eating, buy it again. I wish you a wonderful grilling season. Here's some more grilling ideas for you to check out, and if you are ever in the Boston area, maybe I'll see you in one of my classes.